All right, so we've created a pretty cool web part at this point, at least in my opinion. Hopefully you agree. And with this web part, thus far, we've only been testing it inside of our workbench, both the local and the remote workbench. But let's say that we decide we're done. We've done all the testing, we've added all the features we need, and we're ready to actually deploy this web part to our SharePoint environment. And what we're going to be doing first is we're just going to run a couple of commands inside of our terminal. So I'm going to hit Control-C to stop our gulp local workbench, and we're going to run a couple of other commands. And you'll see if you run gulp -- tasks, you actually have several other commands that are available other than the ones that we have been using. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. We've used gulp serve quite a bit, and way back in the very beginning, we ran the gulp trust dev cert. But there's several other commands here that we can use. So for example, I can run gulp bundle, and that's probably already been done if you've been running a gulp serve, but it's generally good practice to go ahead and just run this command to bundle up your solution before you actually deploy it. So I always run the -- ship flag on here because that's going to kind of just bundle it up in release mode to make sure all the assets that we need to deploy this are going to be available in that bundle. Once we've done that, let's also run a gulp package - solution also with the -- ship flag. So this is going to take that bundle that we just created and it's going to create a file, which you'll see right up here is in the SharePoint /solution /dash.spfpkg. And if we go into Visual Studio Code, you'll see it actually created a whole new folder inside of this solution. And there, sure enough, is that file. And that's kind of like a zip file. SPPKG stands for SharePoint Package. If you want to know what's in there, you can look at this debug file. It automatically generates all these XML things. And if you've been doing SharePoint development for quite a while now, you may be familiar with things like the manifest.xml. And if that's something that's in your wheelhouse, if you feel comfortable working with those, you can actually make that a part of your deployment process and kind of customize the XML that gets created. But for now, the good news is if you don't know what that is, you can just not worry about it. It's just being handled for us automatically. All we need to know is we now have this -- .spfpkg file, and we can drag and drop this into our SharePoint environment. So I'm going to right click on this and hit Reveal in Finder. We're going to open that up and you'll see here's that file. It contains everything we need to deploy this solution. And what I'll do is I'll jump back over to our browser window here, and we're going to go into our Office 365 tenant, and I'm going to open a new tab because whenever you deploy this, you need to deploy this SPPKG file to what's called the app catalog. And if you're on Office 365, you're just going to go to yourtenant.sharepoint.com/sites/app catalog, like so. If you are on premises, depending on how your environment was set up, this could be a different URL. It could be a subdomain or whatever. You just need to ask your tenant administrator where you can find the app catalog. But regardless, you're going to open up a site where you can basically drag and drop files like this SPPKG file to actually deploy it to your environment. So let's go into this link here that says Distribute Apps for SharePoint. So let's go in here and you'll see you get this document library that says Apps for SharePoint. And all we have to do is drag over our SPPKG file and it's going to install that and pop up a window and says, hey, are you sure? Do you trust -client-side solution? And if so, you can hit deploy and it's going to go ahead and deploy that into our environment. And it's now available on all of our site collections. However, before we can actually use that on any individual site collection, you'll notice here if I were to just try to go and add that web part, it's not going to be available just yet. And that's because we have over here towards the right, you'll see tenant deployed is no. There is an option which we'll show in just a moment where you can tenant deploy this solution and it'll actually automatically be available on all sites, so you don't have to manually activate it and kind of opt in to all your different locations. But in this case, we're using the default options, which is tenant deployed no. And that means that if we want to make that web part available on this particular site collection, site/Kyle, I'm going to have to go into our site contents. And then when you click on the little plus here, I can add an app. And whenever we go to add our app, you'll see we now have a new option, dash client-side solution. If I go ahead and click on that, as long as the site owner has permission, they can just click on that to install it. And it does take a moment. You'll see here it is actually grayed out there, and you do need to kind of just keep refreshing until you see that activated. Sometimes that can take just a couple minutes. There we go. So we can see it's now activated. This app is this dash client-side solution app has been deployed to this particular site collection. So if I were to go up here and add a page, I could create a new page called dashboard, and we'll add here. You'll see right down there is our dash web part. And our local workbench is not running. So right now, this is all completely deployed within our SharePoint tenant itself. We can do all of the same stuff that we had done before, but we have now deployed our web part to this particular site. Now, the disadvantage to this approach is if you want to use this in a lot of different site collections, like if I want to use it in all kinds of different places, you're going to have to manually go and add an app and kind of activate it on a site-by-site basis. There is another option that you can choose, and that's going to be to allow that tenant admin. So again, over here, you can see that tenant deployed. And if you do want to activate that, there's a couple ways to do that. So first of all, whenever you set up a Yeoman template, so if we were to go here and just make a test directory, I already have one, so let's remove that. But if we were to make a test directory and then cd into that and run the Yeoman Microsoft / SharePoint generator, one of the things that we've kind of glazed over in the past as we accept a lot of these defaults is this tenant admin thing. And this actually does, this is what that question is do you want to tenant admin deploy this solution whenever you deploy it? And you'll see here, it's gonna say immediately deploy to all sites without running feature deployment or adding apps in sites. And that's basically what this is asking. So if you know you want this to be available everywhere, you can just answer yes to this question whenever you're setting this up. And then everything else can be the same. I'm gonna go ahead and hit Control-C because we don't actually wanna work, so I don't need to install the NPM dependencies. But if we actually open this up, the only difference that does is you'll notice there's this config folder and then package solution. And what it does is it adds an option called skip feature deployment to this solution option here. And this file just kind of gives you some information about how this is going to be deployed. You can see the solution version there. You can see the solution name up here. And if you want to customize any of this, you can just open up this package solution.json file and change the values, including allowing skipping feature deployment. So if we want to retroactively do that in our solution, we can just close this, and in our config / package solution, we can just add a comma here and say skip feature deployment is true. And now that we've added that, whenever we go to deploy this once again, we're going to run a gulp. Oh, we need to go back up to the right directory. So let's go back up to dash, and we'll run gulp build in ship mode. And we'll also run gulp package solution in ship mode as well. So that's going to build that same file, which you see is refreshed right here. And now in our app catalog, when I drag and drop this in, I'm going to have the option to replace it. And now we get a new checkbox on this trust screen. And you do have to check this for this to work. But what we can do is we can say, make this solution available to all sites in the organization. And this is kind of nice because whenever you deploy it, you'll see over on the right, tenant admin or tenant deployed is going to change to yes. And now, even if I haven't chosen to add that as an app, I'm going to have that available everywhere. So I can even go to site contents in this case, and I can remove this. I can remove. And you actually have to do that in this silly classic version for some reason, it looks like. So we'll go ahead and remove that. And again, we need to, let's go back a screen, and we'll just refresh while that's grayed out until we see it actually disappears. Cool, and that has disappeared. And now if we go try to create a new page yet again, we'll create another dashboard. We'll go to add that, and it's still going to be available, even though we haven't added it as an app to this particular site. Because it's tenant deployed, we can use this everywhere. Now, you do need permission to be able to deploy solutions. So if you have an issue deploying your web parts, you may need to elevate your permissions. You may need to either get access to the app catalog itself, or you may need to have tenant admin permissions to be able to actually trust the solutions. I think those are two different permission levels. So if you're not working in your own tenant admin where you're kind of a super administrator, you may need to ask for additional permissions to do that if you encounter any issues there. But that's basically the process. That's how you're going to get this deployed. And as soon as that's deployed, this web part is now ready to go everywhere that you want to use it. And you can choose whether you want to do tenant deployed or kind of choose on a site-by-site basis how that's going to work. Another thing I should mention while we're talking about deployment is in this solution file, you can also optionally provide a features array. And this is really interesting because this will actually allow you to add additional feature XML files. And feature XML files are way beyond the scope of this series. It's something that's been around in SharePoint for ages. And if you're used to doing SharePoint development the old way, where you're building Visual Studio solutions and apps, that may feel very familiar to you. And you may feel right at home building XML schemas and manifest files, if you will. But even if this is entirely new to you, just know that this is what they basically call provisioning in your SharePoint applications. And what that means is if you have a web part or you have some aspect of your SharePoint framework solution that relies on things like a content type or a site column, or having a list be available somewhere, or having a library with files be available somewhere, you can actually write XML files using the provisioning schema in SharePoint to do just about anything on feature activation. And what that means is you would define a set of features, so you could have a deploy site columns feature and a deploy content types feature. And you would create an array of those here, and then you would basically have some XML files. And if we create one and just using the autocomplete, you can kind of see the sort of stuff you would provide to that. But you're going to have this assets object that's going to contain element files and element manifests and upgrade actions. And basically it's just a way to carry over that same functionality that's been around for a long time. But just in case you do want to get into that, you do know that you need to deploy things like content types and site columns and files and such that are not necessarily just a web part. Maybe it's kind of something outside of the scope of a web part. The features API is a great way to do that in your deployments. But we're not going to go over that now because that is a huge learning curve in and of itself. The schema itself is pretty crazy to wrap your head around. So, but I will post some links down in the video description below if you're interested in learning more about writing your own features for these deployments. Cool. So another thing you should know when you're working with your deployments of your web parts, if we go to our web part manifest file, this actually has a lot to do with the way this is deployed and way this is perceived from users as well. So for example, down in our pre-configured entries, we've used this a lot to customize our web part properties. But we haven't talked a lot about what all these other things are in these pre-configured entries. And in particular, you may have noticed whenever we go to add this web part to the page, we have this very boring sort of page icon that's defining what the icon is for that web part, whereas all your other web parts have kind of these nice stylized icons. And you can actually customize that. You'll notice that one of the options in here is called Office Fabric Icon Font Name, and it's defaulting to page. So if you want to switch to a different icon, we can just open up the Office UI Fabric page and we can pick a new icon name and replace that. So for example, if I want some sort of chart icon, I could take one of these, like I like bar chart 4 in this case, and we'll just replace page with bar chart 4. Also, if you want to change the title of this as it appears in that web part adder, that web part picker, you can change the title right here. And you can even localize this. So this is an object where you can, for example, if you had a French translation of your title or the group or the description, you could come in here and change that just by providing a new translated string over here. So lots of different options in this pre-configured entries, but let's try out this new icon that we just provided. We don't have to go through the processes of deploying. We can actually see this by just running gulp serve on our local workbench, and you'll see that new icon in place. And when we go to add a new web part, sometimes it doesn't refresh. You may have to give it a couple extra refreshes for that to actually show up. And there's our icon, which is looking much better. Another thing to note about those pre-configured entries is it is indeed an array of entries. So just to demonstrate how you would use this, if you had a solution where for some reason you wanted two versions of this same web part, but you wanted to have them appear as two different web parts in the web part picker, what you could do, for example, is I could have a bar chart web part and a line chart web part. And maybe we can even have a different icon for the line chart. Maybe we'll use this stacked line chart right here. I think that one looks good. And then you could have a different description and have it organized differently, but then you can basically have two sets of default web part properties. So here we could change the default line chart type to line. You can even have different colors or whatever you want there. But what's going to happen is now when we serve this to our local workbench, we'll probably have to refresh, maybe even stop our gulp server and restart it. The web part manifest changes, when you make those, they are what I would call sticky. It's kind of hard to get them to refresh. So let's actually close and restart our gulp serve to start a new local workbench. Close the old local workbench, and let's give this a moment to refresh once again. And there we go. So you can see the two entries there. So we can add a bar chart, and then if we were to select a sample list and some data, you can see that defaults as a bar chart. And we can also add a line chart where if we did the same thing, it's going to have completely a different default chart type. So if you wanted for some reason to do this, I think there's some good use cases where this would be useful. You could even just remove the chart type and not make that editable, but make the user instead choose from multiple options that you have in your pre-configured entries. And that's totally up to you how you want to organize it. I think in this case, it doesn't make as much sense. I like having it configurable in the web part properties. So we're just going to take that back to the way it was before with a quick undo. There we go. And now that this has actually updated, if you want to make updates to your web part, like in this case, we updated the icon, all we'd have to do is come into our package JSON. Let's just update the version number. I don't know that you actually have to do this, but I generally do. I think it's good practice to say something has changed. We have a new version of this solution, and then we can simply rerun our gulp build command as well as our gulp package solution command to generate a new SP package file. Like so. So let's open up Finder. We have our updated dash thing here. We'll go to our app catalog. We will drag and drop this file into here and replace it. We will make sure that this checkbox is still checked and hit deploy. And you'll see that version number has now updated. And you'll notice that this is currently appearing as checked out. So I generally make sure that we go to advanced and check in and hit OK there. Great. And that's how we're going to update our solutions as we make changes. And finally, if you don't want to be restricted to just a Office Fabric icon, you also have an option here to provide an icon image URL. This would have to be hosted on a CDN like Amazon S3 or Azure or something like that is going to be publicly available, but you just type in the web address to the image and you can use an image instead of an icon. And you'll even see there, if you hold your mouse over it, it says it needs to be exactly 38 by 38 pixels. So make sure that you do that if you do decide to use an image. Cool. And that's going to do it for our Dash web part. As you can see, we've created a nice extensible web part, and we've gone through the entirety of building this from scratch all the way through to deploying it and using it in our actual SharePoint environment. I've really enjoyed building this, and hopefully you have as well. And I would highly recommend trying to do some of your own customizations unguided to this web part. Maybe there's some things that are specific to your business or a new type of visualization that you'd like to add to the web part. And I think it's a great opportunity and a great way to learn the SharePoint framework by trying something new, something that you haven't done before.